Yeah, so thanks so much, Brian, for the invitation to be here. And what I'd like to do is give a overview of kind of my take, I suppose. I'll just speak for myself on the current state of the art in terms of what we know about lucid dreaming from neuroscience and psychology right now. And this is kind of the the groundwork for any kind of technology to induce lucid dreams. Really, the foundation is really the scientific understanding of the neural basis of lucid dreaming, and that informs how we may be able to induce it. So here's an overview of what I had in mind. Start off with a little bit of a broad background just to make sure we're all on the same page. I think it's pretty familiar to most people here, but just by way of lead-in, start off with some introduction definitions and talk a little bit about some of the background in terms of how lucid dreaming is validated in the lab and what we know about lucid dreaming currently in terms of physiological correlates and neuroimaging, EEG, and how lucid dreaming can be used as a method itself. And then ending with probably the most exciting part is the induction of lucid dreams. And I'm mostly going to focus on galantamine there, but of course there are other exciting methods which we can kind of use as a jumping off place into the discussion. So I want to start off just kind of highlighting the fact that it's strange that we're not always lucid. So every night we spend about a third of our life paralyzed, hallucinating. We call these experiences dreams. We're embodied in a 3D multimodal world, and we completely don't realize the nature of our experience while it's happening, which is really strange considering that many of these experiences are completely consistent and congruent with the entire rest of our lives, and yet we still don't notice that we're dreaming. So we can say that while we're dreaming, we're usually unaware that we're lying in bed, we're unaware that the images we're seeing are hallucinatory, and we're just generally unaware that we're dreaming. And this is a mystery from the scientific perspective. Why aren't we always lucid? But for most people, lucid dreams are the very infrequent exception. And the minimalist definition, which we adopt, is just that you're dreaming while you're dreaming. So if you realize that you're dreaming while continuing to stay asleep and continuing to be in the dream, then you're lucid. It's very interesting, though, that there seems to be a kind of constellation of phenomenological features that all come back together once you make that state shift into lucidity, including things like episodic memory. So, for example, your ability to remember your waking life, including intentions for things you wanted to do in the dream. Also, your capacity to exert control, decide what you want to do, what you want to attend to. And so all of these things are somehow, I think, in a really interesting way related to each other in a way that we're still trying to understand. That's partly getting into work in the philosophy of mind to think about how these different aspects of consciousness all go together with that shift into lucidity. And Thomas Metzinger and Jennifer Vent, I think, are some of the best people doing work in that area, trying to relate it to what they call a shift in our self model. That's something I'm interested in as well. Here's just a quick example. I think we all know, but I'd like to start off with this. It just gives a sense of kind of what the experience is like. It says, I was standing in a field in an open area when my wife pointed in the direction of the sunrise. I looked at it and thought, how odd, never seen colors like that before. Then it dawned on me, I must be dreaming. Never had I experienced such clarity and perception. The colors were so beautiful and the sense of freedom so exhilarating that I started racing through this beautiful golden wheat field, waving my hands in the air and yelling at the top of my voice, I'm dreaming, I'm dreaming. Suddenly, I started to lose the dream. It must have been the excitement. I instantly woke up. As it dawned on me what had just happened, I woke my wife and said, I did it. I did it. I was conscious within the dream state, and I'll never be the same. And so this is a fun example. I think it does illustrate a lot of the things that we typically see in the laboratory and in reports from people who have lucid dreams at home, that there does seem to be this intrinsic sense of exhilaration, the thrill of realizing the state you're in. And often that does cause people to wake up too, because physiologically you get that excitement response and that can cause an awakening. But of course, with time and training, you can learn to modulate that and stay in the lucid dream for longer. Just a few quick comments on why lucid dreams, why we're studying it in the sleep lab. One method, which I'll come back to, is that it's a method. It's a very powerful method for doing research on the REM sleep dreaming state that overcomes a lot of limitations. And I think it really has huge potential for scientific research on consciousness. There's a variety of clinical applications that are of interest. The biggest one right now is in treatment of chronic idiopathic nightmare disorder, which occurs in a pretty surprising percentage of the American adult population. I think it's like something between 5 and 7%. People who have nightmares for unknown reasons. And it's now part of the official American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommendations for first-line treatments. And then, so of course, we think about science, we think about clinical applications, but more broadly, I think we're really thinking about this phrase, which I love, which I took from Michael Pollan, the betterment of well people. This is a kind of uncharted domain of our mind, and what can we make of it? Let's explore it together and see what's possible in the state. From more of like a kind of Silicon Valley perspective, if you prefer, you can think of dreaming as a kind of underutilized resource. So we spend, roughly a third of our lives asleep. You're going to spend at least 5 years of your life dreaming, probably a lot more than that. It's difficult to get a precise estimate, but you're going to spend a huge amount of time, many years dreaming. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? And the idea is that lucid dreaming allows us to really open up new potential of the state, other things. There's been lots of different applications discussed: entertainment, rehearsal of skills, creativity and artistic pursuits, which is a particular interest of mine, many others as well. And so there's just tremendous potential here. And again, the potential for technology to, and a scientific understanding of this to be able to open it up to humanity for exploration. So that's the big picture goal. Coming back, I want to kind of come back to the beginning of the story for a moment, when research first began, because it's worth reminding ourselves that kind of research on this got off to a rocky start. There were philosophers and sleep scientists for many decades who kind of were skeptical that lucid dreaming was a true phenomenon of sleep. This is a quote from Norman Malcolm, a philosopher, for example, in the late 1950s. It says, "The supposed judgment that one is dreaming is unintelligible and an inherently absurd form of words." Because people just couldn't understand. They thought, how can you be fully conscious and at the same time asleep? It seemed like an oxymoron and just something that was difficult to understand unless you'd experienced it. But research really got kicked off by work at Stanford in Bill DeMint's lab, who's one of the late great sleep scientists of the 20th century. And one of the discoveries that they made in the 1960s and 70s was that the physical rotations of the eyes, as observed with electrical recordings near the eyeballs in a sleep lab, track the gaze direction of where the person is looking in the dream. So this is one of my favorite examples. They had a person in the sleep lab wired up with electrodes. The right and left oculogram here showing the right and left eye movements. The person looked left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, about 12 times in a row. Very unusual pattern. You don't see this happening by chance. They woke the person up and said, "Just now, what were you dreaming about?" And he said he was standing on the side of a ping pong table watching a long volley of the ping pong ball going back and forth, and his eyes were tracking the ball. So it's from this and a lot of other research that it was discovered that the physical eyes can often track where the dreamer is looking. Just as a side note, it's not always the case. Some of the eye movements in REM sleep seem to be unrelated to where the person is looking in the dream, but some of them are very tightly correlated. And so this gave a name that's probably familiar to most of us here, now famous researcher on lucid dreaming, Stephen LaBerge, who was then a young graduate student in DeMint's lab an idea. Said, well, if I become lucid in the dream, I should be able to move my eyes in a certain pre-agreed upon direction, and that will provide objective evidence of being lucid. And so this actually shows the first signal that was sent from the dream world to the waking world here by LaBerge. That was the eye signal there, which is just a single up-down eye movement. By itself, not particularly convincing, but it was a first start. And more convincing, he actually Morse coded his initials, which were picked up by electrodes on his forearms. Incidentally, you are mostly paralyzed in REM, but you can get motor potentials read out sometimes if with the proper placement of the electrodes. So pretty impressive. He Morse coded his initials. So this was some of the first evidence that you can volitionally communicate from the REM sleep dreaming state to the waking state. Here's an example of one of the signals collected in our sleep laboratory at UW-Madison. And this is the signal that's kind of become the gold standard now. And labs all over the world are using this. It's a single pair of full scale left, right, center eye movements. You can see that the signal stands out pretty dramatically from the background horizontal HEOG or horizontal electrooculogram, because the signals are full scale. So we instruct the participant or the dreamer to look as if they're looking at each ear. And this creates these very high amplitude, very distinct signals. And we can see this is happening in EEG and other physiologically verified REM sleep. So we can have objective evidence that the person is lucid, and also a timestamp of approximately where that lucidity occurred in the record. Here's some other examples of eye signals. You can see that there is some individual variation, but on the whole, they stand out very dramatically, and they're very easily recognizable from the ongoing background REMs. So this really kicked off the whole scientific study of lucid dreaming, which really kind of took off in the late 1970s and more in the early 80s, with work mostly from Stephen LaBerge, but also from others. And one of the first discoveries, which is held up to this day, and I think is really one of the most robust findings now, is that lucid dreams occur predominantly in the stage of REM sleep, and they occur predominantly during the most activated epochs of REM sleep, the most activated points of REM sleep. So throughout REM sleep, there are kind of peaks and valleys of activation, and lucidity tends to occur at the mountaintops, at the parts of REM where our brain is most active. And so this shows a few different measures of autonomic nervous system activities, such as eye movements in the top left, heart rate in the top right, and respiration rate in the bottom left. All measures of increased autonomic activation. And that vertical white line down the middle is where the eye movement signal occurred. So it's approximately marking that lucidity onset. And so you can see that all these measures tend to be elevated at lucidity onset, and they also, interestingly, tend to stay elevated. The bottom right there is the skin potential response that goes along with that excitement response that I mentioned at the beginning, that you don't always see it, but sometimes you do. And people can get the thrill of gaining lucidity, so you do sometimes see that characteristic excitement response as measured by the skin potential. And so all of this, kind of putting it all together in terms of the early research, tells us that lucid dreams tend to occur in the most activated stages of REM sleep. They occur in unequivocal sleep, and they're associated with this overall activation of the brain, these different measures of activation. But of course, this raises so many other questions. From a cognitive neuroscience perspective, we immediately want to ask, okay, that's interesting, but are there specific areas of the brain that are more active? Are there specific patterns of brain rhythms, for example, that go along with that shift to lucidity? And so this has spurred on more studies. Unfortunately, the EEG studies have kind of appeared sporadically over the last 40 years. There's only about 4 of them in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and they're often underpowered, and they have different kinds of methodological issues. So it's difficult to compare them. And unfortunately, every single one has reported a different brain EEG signature of lucidity. So it's a mixed bag right now, and we really need more research. The current data with neuroimaging, like with fMRI, for example, measuring where blood is flowing in the brain, is even more scant. But here there is kind of an initial convergence taking shape, or at least the inkling of one, which I want to point to as a possibility. Of course, we need a lot more work on this, and we need to replicate these findings. But I think there is something interesting here, at least to pivot off of as a starting place. So that's what I'm going to start with. And some people may have seen this study, but it's just briefly, it is this is the one data point we have from a person who had a lucid dream inside of an fMRI scanner. And so it's a case report, N of 1, so with all the caveats entailed. With a case report, again, not a group level study, so it's more difficult to generalize. Maybe he's just weird, but it's a starting place. And what they found was, and they had, of course, concurrent EEG and other polysomnography, so they could tell the person was in REM sleep, and they had the eye movement signals with the objective evidence of lucidity. And what they found was comparing the lucid REM sleep dreaming section to the baseline REM sleep segment, they found increases in fMRI bold signal, again, measuring increases in blood flow to these regions in the anterior prefrontal cortex, the very front tip of the prefrontal cortex, along with the lateral parietal cortex and the medial parietal region, referred to as the precuneus, along with some activations in the middle temporal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus, and some occipital regions as well. So a pretty wide array of regions, but mostly centered on this frontoparietal network. In our recent work, we've followed up on this from a slightly different perspective with neuroimaging, taking an individual differences approach. And I'd like to see much more work on this. It's easier research to do, which is partly why we were able to do it. But I think it's a complementary line of work. And so looking at the population as a whole, there are, probably about half the population may never have a lucid dream in their entire lifetime. And then coming down, maybe 10 to 15, one per month, and getting down to less than 1% that's having them on the order of every night. I think it's more like 1 in 1,000 from our mass survey data, roughly, that have lucid dreams on the order of every single night. It's very interesting. These people are out there. Maybe there's some even in the audience tonight. Some of which, when they hear that other people aren't lucid all the time, they're amazed by that, and that's really interesting. Some of these people are actively then get an interest in it, but many of them just seem to have it happening, and they may be interested or somewhat blasé about it, or mildly indifferent. But we wanted to ask, with this very high frequency group, are there any differences in the brain structure or the connectivity of the brains of people who are having lucid dreams on the order of every other night to every night? And we actually didn't find any differences in the structure of the brain. So you can look at the thickness of the cortex across the whole brain with different methods, and we didn't see any differences in the density of gray matter or the thickness of the cortex. But we did find that there was increased connectivity between a specific region of the frontal pole and the lateral parietal regions, as well as the middle temporal gyrus. And so you may already be noting to yourself just how much that overlaps with the other study, which I'll come back to in a minute. But just briefly, we didn't see any differences in large-scale resting state networks. So there's a lot of different networks in the brain now that can be picked out just by observing the brain at rest, visual networks, other kinds of networks. We didn't see any differences there, but we did see this specific set of regions, which that set overlapped most strongly with the frontal parietal control network. And so we're interested in these findings for a couple reasons. One is the very striking overlap with what we have from the fMRI case study. So the top here again is showing that same data from the fMRI case study, showing the regions which have increased bold signal from that study, and the bottom is showing the regions which we found to have increased connectivity in this group of high frequency lucid dreamers. So it's both are picking out these lateral parietal regions and the middle temporal gyrus, connecting more with the frontal pole. It's also interesting from what we know about the neurobiology of REM sleep more generally. And so this is a meta-analysis of studies comparing REM sleep to wakefulness. And the blue icons are showing studies which found decreased blood flow or metabolism in REM sleep compared to wake. And the orange or yellowish icons are showing regions which have increased activation in REM sleep compared to wake. And you can see that this same set of prefrontal and lateral parietal and middle temporal gyrus, as well as medial parietal regions, tends to have suppressed activity during REM sleep dreaming compared to wakefulness. And so, whereas a number of other regions show increased activity. And so that's interesting because it kind of converges in an interesting way with the other results. We can say that that set of regions is some fancy abbreviations, which means the anterior prefrontal cortex, the lateral parietal cortex, which includes the AG, the angular gyrus, and the middle temporal gyrus. All of these regions, they're typically deactivated or suppressed during REM sleep compared to wake. Those same regions show increased bold signal during lucid REM sleep compared to baseline, and individuals who have lucid dreams with high frequency have increased connectivity within these same regions. Also, more generally, we know that these regions tend to be involved with the kinds of cognitive functions that are at least related to lucidity. Executive control, attention functions, metacognition, these kinds of things. So it's also plausible on first principles that they may be involved. So that's the summary of where we're at in terms of the neuroimaging of the state right now. Now, that's from the fMRI side of the coin. And, you know, just a couple of studies, we really need a group level fMRI study. That's the next big thing that I think would really move the field forward. But shifting for a moment back to the EEG side of the table, here things are much more mixed. As I mentioned, we have these 4 studies. Every single one of them shows a different purported EEG signature of lucidity. One found increased central alpha, one found increased ratio of frontal parietal beta, one found increased frontal gamma activity, and one found decreased delta activity in frontocentral electrodes. But as you can see, many of these only have a few electrodes, 1 electrode, 4 electrodes. For example, 6 electrodes only cover the anterior part of the scalp, and so whereas others only cover the central or posterior parts, and so it's difficult to compare between studies. One of the things we've been trying to do in our recent work, and this is also connecting with the conversation that we had last time in this group, which I particularly wanted to highlight, is trying to see if we can clarify the nature of some of these existing findings. And the biggest one, the one that has really gotten the most attention, both of the scientific and popular press, is this finding, which was published in Sleep in 2009 by Voss and colleagues, in which they analyzed lucid REM sleep from 3 subjects and compared that within subjects to their baseline REM sleep activity. And what they reported finding was increased gamma activity, essentially right here in frontolateral electrodes. But there was a major limitation of this study, which is that they corrected for eye movements, but they did not correct for the muscular or myogenic component of the eye movements. And so when you process EEG, there's lots of different kinds of corrections for different sorts of artifacts you have to make. And unfortunately, the methods they used didn't account for the myogenic component of the artifact. And so one of the things we wanted to do in our recent work was to explore whether this result actually reflects a difference in gamma at the cortex, or whether instead it reflects differences in eye movement density. One of the reasons that we were skeptical of this finding and wanted to critically investigate it was what I mentioned earlier. We know from the prior literature that lucid dreaming tends to be associated with increased eye movement density. And so indeed, if lucid dreaming has increased eye movement density, you would expect that you'd find an increase in this frontal gamma, which would be reflecting the eye movement activity instead of something else. And so what we first wanted to do was replicate that earlier finding that I mentioned in terms of looking at the REM density in the lucid and baseline REM sleep. And so here you can see the eye movement density on the y-axis. These are minutes leading up to lucidity onset, 0 marking lucidity onset with the eye movement signal. And you can see that the white bars after becoming lucid all show elevated EM density compared to the baseline period. We do see a little bit of an increase just before lucidity as well, but particularly after the shift to becoming lucid. So we then wanted to see, as I mentioned, whether that result is due to a cortical difference or difference in myogenic activity. And this is getting pretty detailed, but I think it's kind of interesting that this very top panel here is showing every eye movement. And so these are the REMs and REM sleep. And those large deflections are the corneoretinal dipole offsets from the eyes moving. So the eye is like a dipole. When you rotate it, it creates those offsets. But you also see those little blips just before each one. And those are called the pre-psychotic spike potentials. And that reflects the muscular component of the eye movement. And so you can see that down in the third row here is using a regression technique to get rid of those large deflections. And that's the method that was used by Voss in their data cleaning. But it doesn't actually get rid of those little blips, which are the myogenic component of the eye movements. And you can see that in the time frequency transform just below, where you have those red increases in 40 hertz power concurrent with each of those psychotic spike potentials. And so what we did was we computed a time frequency transform for every subject and every REM period. And we then, with an algorithm, marked every single instance of the pre-psychotic spike potential. And then we cut those out of the record and we processed it both ways. We also processed it with a method called independent component analysis, which can get rid of muscular as well as other kinds of artifacts. And this is a summary of what we found. So using the regression technique that Voss used, we replicated this increase in frontal 40 hertz power in lucid dreams compared to baseline REM sleep. Also using a variation which was used by Voss called the current source densities. But when we take out those pre-psychotic spike potentials, we don't see any difference in frontal 40 hertz power between the lucid dreaming and the baseline REM sleep, and likewise with the ICA method. So really is best more replication of the fact that lucid dreams have increased eye movement density instead of something at the cortical level with that frontal 40 hertz power. We did some exploratory analysis as well of differences in EEG features. And to my surprise, we did see some differences in power. And so in EEG power, that is. And so we actually did see some overall differences in low frequency power below 4 hertz, as well as some decreases in the low beta band, or really the whole beta band, I should say, between 12.5 and 35 hertz. And so you can see that in the A panel there, those blue with the white dots showing those reductions in EEG power in those frequency bands. We also saw some decreases in low frequency power and low frequency coherence as well. And that actually, both the decrease in EEG power in low frequencies and the decrease in coherence replicates a study by Daudet and colleagues, one of the 4 that I mentioned at the beginning there. So we actually replicate that finding. And there's decreases in slow frequencies in the EEG typically go with increased activation. And so it's consistent with this overall picture of increased activation. And so we now have at least two different analyses suggesting that that lucidity is associated with reduced slow frequencies. C here is showing some differences in complexity, which is a measure also which tracks with activation and tracks with consciousness across a variety of domains. And so we had 14 recordings here. In all but one, we saw increases in complexity in the lucid dreaming compared to the baseline REM sleep. So I think this is really interesting and another promising measure that's come out of this the exploratory analysis. One thing that's really important here, all of these different things, so the increased REM density, the decreases in delta and beta power, it's not a special signature of lucidity. So you can look at a histogram for the lucid epochs. If you can segment the lucid dreaming part, and you can segment the baseline REM sleep comparison part. And here we've done that. The lucid dream is shown in red. The baseline is shown in blue. And you can see that the distributions overlap completely. So in fact, both ordinary, quote unquote, baseline non-lucid REM sleep and lucid dreaming have these different levels of activation throughout them. So if you look over time, even the baseline REM sleep segment, baseline non-lucid dreaming, has these same amounts of density or delta power or beta power occurring, but we don't become lucid. So that's important to note, I think, in terms of the overall picture of how to interpret these particular results. There may be an EEG signature of lucidity, but we don't have it yet. And instead, all of this is really pointing to an overall picture that's consistent with the earlier work that was done in the 80s and 90s, showing this increased activation. Indeed, the replicating the finding that REM density is higher, replicating the Daudet finding of a decrease in delta power, meaning increased activation. And then somewhat surprisingly, that difference in the beta band as well, which we see in this data, which surprised me at first. But actually, after some digging into the literature, it's been pretty widely established that decreases in the beta band go together with increases in phasic activation during REM. And so we think this is just another measure, another marker of phasic activation. And it turns out that those REMs can actually desynchronize beta oscillations. So
do we have time for one quick question? I know I'm violating the rule, but maybe it gives you a chance to take a pause. I see Allison raised her hand.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Allison.
You're muted.
Oh, okay.
I'm still on mute. There we go. Here we go.
Nice.
Hi. Thank you. Sorry, I have a ton of questions, but I'll keep it focused on this slide particularly. So it's interesting that we haven't found an EEG signature for lucidity, and that actually sparked a question I had earlier, which was, how are you, in this case, I know that you had previously done the measurements of like, are you lucid, and we've controlled that. How are you, is this a narrative that someone says, I woke up, I had a lucid dream? How are you measuring these people and, in this beta power of like whether they were lucid or not? And how do you control for like, are people reporting that they're lucid? Are you measuring that they're lucid? Is it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because I didn't go into detail on that just due to time, but maybe I should have. So I appreciate you asking that, because so the method we're using here, these are all sleep laboratory recordings in the sleep laboratory with EEG and with polysomnography. And so we're following the gold standard method here, where people are in validated REM sleep with all the physiology. Then they make those left, right, center eye movements, the objective marker, which appears in the physiological record to indicate that they became lucid. Then they wake up afterwards and they give a report of what happened. They say, yes, I became lucid. Yes, I made an eye signal. And then this, that, and the other happened. They give a full dream report. And so lucidity is validated with the convergence of the objective marker in the PSG record together with the subjective report given on awakening. And that's the kind of the gold standard method when you have the convergence of those two. So yeah,
got it. I wasn't sure that this was part of that.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, and so then exactly. So then we can. It's really nice because we have that timestamp in the record of when they became lucid, the eye signal. We can segment the record. We can take the period after they became lucid, and we can compare it to the REM sleep from that same night and same subject before they became lucid as a comparison. So that's what we're doing in all these. We're comparing the lucid dreaming part to the baseline REM sleep segment. Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's great to be able to clarify.
And then I think, just be curious, I know that this isn't part of, or maybe it is at a certain point, just sort of we talk about, and I think you have to have a certain quality level of lucidity to be able to have eye signals. But as we all know, I think on this call, there is a range of quality to it, or control or influence, or we're going to call it, like some lucid dreams are stronger than others, and that might influence some kind of something. So it's just super interesting to see all this as it relates to sort of like the binary, yes, lucid, not lucid, but we know it can continue to grow and expand from there.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the things that we face in the lab. Sometimes we do have people that reported they became lucid, but they didn't make the signal because they forgot or something else. But for the sake of being as careful as we can, making sure that these are indeed lucid dreams, we've elected in this analysis to only analyze the ones where we have the objective proof, so to speak, that they were lucid. But yeah, that's a really interesting point and lots to think about there for sure. So, okay. And so kind of summarizing all of this, maybe my take, I guess, on what we know about the physiology of lucid dreaming from physio and from the physio and EEG side of things. We know that lucid dreams tend to occur during these phasic periods of activation during REM sleep. And these newer results converge with the prior ones, with prior results like increased eye movement density. Here we have a few extra things which all kind of converge on that same thing. So the reductions in low frequency activity, the low frequency spectral power, increases in EEG signal complexity, all of these converge on increased activation. And again, however, this frontal 40 hertz effect we think is actually indicative of this increase in eye movement density rather than a difference in 40 hertz power in frontal cortex. And this frontal 40 hertz power was particularly, I think, got a lot of attention because the authors used the effect to argue that lucid dreaming was a different state altogether than REM sleep or than any of the other sleep stages that we have physiologically. They claim that this result, led to them concluding that lucid dreams are a hybrid state, a physiological state somewhere between REM sleep and wakefulness. But when we properly interpret the effect, it removes that justification for that. And there really, in my view, really isn't any firm justification for making that claim currently. And so the view that I currently hold is that lucid dreams occur in REM sleep. They can potentially occur in other stages of sleep too, but it's not some other sleep stage, physiologically speaking. And here I've listed in a table some of the key physiological features of REM sleep, showing that those are shared during lucid dreaming. Reduction in chin muscle tone, or the characteristic atonia, is maintained during lucid dreaming. The absence of occipital alpha, the maintenance of REMs, and also the reduction of H-reflex, which I didn't talk about, but I'll note a little bit later. And that's exactly in contrast to wakefulness. So, so in summary, I don't think there's any current evidence really supporting this hybrid state view. And we can think of lucid dreams as something that predominantly happens during activated REM sleep. But of course, this is an evolving area of research. It's early days. We have a lot to learn. And so we may need to revise that down the road. But this is how I think of things currently based on all the evidence that I'm aware of. Okay, I think we're doing okay for time. So I just want to give an illustration of one of the things I mentioned earlier of how lucid dreaming can be really useful as a methodology in science. I think this is really exciting, particularly for consciousness. And so I think that dreaming is actually one of the most important states for consciousness research. And here's a quote from Christoph Koch to back that up. Dream states may hold the key to consciousness. And basically, I think that dreaming allows us to study the neural correlates of consciousness in a state of the brain where there's very little input coming into the cortex. So it's very useful because we can rule out a lot of the brain regions which are just involved with processing that external input. And it's also a different global brain state to wakefulness. So it's very useful for theory building and testing. And so we can say that dreaming is very useful for consciousness, and lucid dreaming really allows us to do rigorous research on dreaming in a way that's not possible any other way. So, and I'll give an example of that from one of our recent studies here. So lucid dreaming takes us to be able to study dreaming, which takes us to be able to study consciousness is kind of the idea. This is one of my favorite findings from LaBerge in the early 80s. They compared elapsed time, perception of elapsed time during wake and REM sleep dreaming. Here they made the left-right eye signal, counted to 10, made it again. You can see that it lines up identically with the eye signals in the lucid dream. So this kind of disproves the inception idea that you can live a whole lifetime in your dream in only a couple minutes. We think there's a different mechanism for that. But okay, so coming just briefly, I just want to briefly kind of share this to give a sense of the kind of work that's happening now in the laboratory using lucid dreaming. And the specific question that we tackled here was whether the imagery of dreams is more like waking perception or more like what you imagine when you close your mind, close your eyes and imagine something. And one of the ways to get a objective metric of that is whether you can smoothly track the imagery. And so we know it's pretty much impossible for humans to smoothly track an imagined stimulus. But no one had yet tested whether it was possible to track imagery during dreams. And so just as a little more context, you have a specific brain circuitry which allows your eyes to move in a smooth, sustained fashion when they're following something that's moving in a smooth, sustained way. So this was actually data that was collected a number of years ago, and I worked with LaBerge in bringing it to light, which was a lot of fun. And so here we had participants track circles or lines in their lucid REM sleep dreams during the lucid dream, during waking perception, and during imagination. So they tracked a circle, very slowly moving their thumb in a circle, keeping their eyes locked on the tip of their thumb. They also traced a line back and forth, keeping their eyes locked on the tip of their thumb. And we recorded their eye movements, and we subjected them to a validated algorithm which separates the saccades, those quick jerky eye movements, from the pursuit eye movements, those smooth, sustained eye movements, which have a specific system which allows you to make, and also fixations, just staring straight ahead. And this shows you what some of the raw data looks like. The top here is showing the horizontal electroculogram, measuring the eye movements. You can see the person is saying left, right, left, right. Okay, I'm starting the task. Then this is a horizontal tracking, so they kept their eyes locked on the tip of their thumb, moving it left, slowly, back through, and then back to center. And then they say left, right, I'm done with the task. And here's showing a bunch of the physio showing that this is happening in ongoing REM sleep as marked by reductions in occipital alpha, suppression of the H reflex, and the characteristic atonia during REM as well. So this is all happening in physiologically verified REM sleep. And what we found was that waking perception and REM sleep dreaming, lucid dreaming, had the sustained pursuit movements, whereas the imagination condition had these characteristic catch-up saccades marked with magenta here. So people weren't able to imagine moving their eyes in a smooth way, but when they tracked the visual stimulus during wake and when they tracked it in their lucid dream, we got the sustained smooth motion. As I mentioned, they also tracked circles. So this isn't the greatest example, but it gives you a sense. The top row is showing the clockwise motion, starting with the black box, ending with the checkered flag across the perception, dreaming, and imagination conditions. And the second row is showing the counterclockwise, going the other way. We had one person track an infinity sign. It's not the best there in the lucid dream, but you can see they're still pretty much getting it. And so this is really interesting. What this research is showing us is that people can trace shapes, circles, lines, infinity signs, letters, could be extended to letters, that is, during lucid dreams, which can be read out in real time and plotted on an XY plane by appropriately trained algorithm, which just reads out the eye movements and gets rid of any artifacts. You can basically just trace the shapes. So it allows another way of communicating in real time, which I think has some interesting applications, even beyond lucid dreaming. This is just summarizing the data. On the left here, the blue and green are showing perception and dreaming, normalized scores for pursuit. You can see that we just get high pursuit across dreaming and perception, whereas we get low pursuit scores for the imagination, shown in red here. And so this is kind of going over this just to give an illustration of the kinds of things that we can use lucid dreaming to do in a sleep lab to answer scientific questions. And so there's a lot that we learned from this study. we learn that a purely perceived image, that there's no external physical stimulus, that's sufficient to drive the human smooth pursuit system, which has a lot of ramifications for our understanding of the neural circuitry of pursuit and how that works in humans and so forth. And also, I think one of the broader philosophical take-homes is that, at least in this respect, the imagery of REM sleep dreaming, it's much more like waking perception. We think much more vivid, much more detailed typically, as in comparison to imagination. And so in terms of lucid dreaming as this powerful method, I think the biggest point is that it really allows us to have experimental control during REM sleep, during dreams, in a way that is pretty much impossible any other way. So this experiment, there's no other way to do it other than with lucid dreamers. And people can do these experimental tasks. Lucid dreamers can go into the dream state on a mission to do a particular task. And that allows a whole different kind of research than's possible with non-lucid dreaming. And I wanted to illustrate this too, because I think it really shows the power of the eye signaling method, not just to signal that I'm lucid, but also people can make these signals to say, I'm starting a task, I'm ending a task, I'm perceiving this kind of content, this and that. And so, so it's a really powerful method for science, for cognitive neuroscience and psychology. But of course, the big challenge is that it occurs rarely for most people. And what we really need, and what one of the things this group is about, is trying to make it accessible for everyone so we can really tap into its potential. Just want to summarize some of the main techniques that have been discussed over the years. Of course, the cognitive techniques, probably the most widely known is the mnemonic induction lucid dreams technique, that basically training your prospective memory to try to remember to become lucid when you perceive a particular content. Sleep structuring, so waking up an hour and a half before you normally would, staying awake for at least 30 minutes, then going back to sleep, has been shown to increase lucid dreaming frequency. There have been a few papers in the empirical literature which have explored non-invasive electrical current stimulation methods, which we had a long dialogue about last week or last session. There's some debate amongst scientists about the validity of these techniques. My view is that the data show that they don't work, but that doesn't mean that other kinds of stimulation might not be effective. I think this is a really interesting future direction. There's only 2 studies here, and they're only tapping into a very small part of the parameter space. And so I'd like to see much more research on non-invasive electrical current stimulation. And then the one that I've been most involved with is the pharmacological approach using galantamine, which is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. But of course, there's also a lot of interest now happening and ongoing research in different laboratories, including our laboratory with cueing devices. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it'd be great if we could talk more about this in the open session afterwards. I'll start it off with the Dreamlight and the Nova Dreamer, which were brought to light, no pun intended, by the Lucidity Institute. Basically sleep masks tricked out with a computer chip and red LEDs typically, which detect if you're in REM sleep and then flash, try to give you cues. And one thing I just want to highlight here, though, is that I think the sleep tech has enormous potential, but I think it is important to keep in the dialogue the cognitive techniques too, because to some extent those set the foundation for these devices being effective. So I think it is important to keep that in mind and to think about ways in which we may be able to break away from that, or whether we can't. So I'm interested in discussing that too. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So in the remaining couple minutes here, I want to review this study that we did published several years ago in PLOS ONE, looking at the effect of galantamine on lucid dreaming frequency. And this is really started by Stephen LaBerge over many, many years. The Lucidity Institute found that acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like Aricept increase the frequency of lucid dreams, particularly in samples of high-frequency lucid dreamers. So in this study, which the data was collected over many years, at these Hawaii retreats, we wanted to get a large sample and quantify the size and the reliability of the effect of acetylcholinesterase inhibition or galantamine on lucid dreaming, and also see how well we can do by putting it together with wake back to bed and the mnemonic induction of lucid dreams techniques. So this combined induction protocol, how well can we do? And this was a double-blind placebo-controlled study with 121 people using a counterbalance within subjects design. So everyone had the full dose, a half dose, and a placebo. This is a schematic of the procedure. So people slept for about 3 REM cycles, shown with the gray bars. They woke up and they took one of the 3 doses of galantamine. So they did this whole thing on 3 different nights. Either 0 placebo, 4 milligrams the half dose, or 8 milligrams the full dose. They then stayed awake for 30 minutes. Then they went back to sleep for what we call the experimental nap segment, shown with the last 2 gray bars there. Then they woke up and gave a dream report. And what we found was that there was a substantial, really a huge effect of galantamine on the frequency of lucid dreams. So base here is showing the expected percentage of people reporting a lucid dream based on the baseline rate of lucidity for this group, about 6%. The placebo, which is really the full placebo procedure, including the wake back to bed and the cognitive training techniques, got people up to about 12, 13%. The 4 milligrams half dose got people up to 27%, and the full dose 42%. So this is a whopping effect. About 42% of the people in this sample were able to have at least one lucid dream in that experimental nap segment using this combined procedure. So this is a very effective method for making lucid dreaming more accessible. And I think it's a really interesting scientific question too. I think it's a really, in my mind, maybe the most, and one of the most important findings to try to understand more mechanistically why this is happening. Because we know that galantamine stimulates lucid dreaming in a very strong way, in a dose-related manner, but we don't know the mechanism. I mean, it's plausible. The effect is cholinergically related, but we know these substances can also have other effects on other neurotransmitter systems. So it's important to really dig in mechanistically in future studies to see how exactly this effect is occurring. I think understanding how this effect is occurring in terms of the neurobiology will give us important clues about the nature of lucidity from a physiological perspective, which can help, again, open it up and make it more accessible, which is really the goal here. So I want to wrap up because I'm looking forward mostly to the discussion here. So just want to point people to, if you want to dig in more to any of this research, you can check out our recent review paper in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. If anyone doesn't have access, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy. And with that, just wrap up. And thank you so much to my collaborators and advisors, Stephen LeBurge, Julia Tononi, and the funders. And thanks so much for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being here. And that's a great overview of the field and where it could go in the future. So yeah, I think the rest of the time we got open for Q&A. I know people were dropping questions in the chat during Ben's presentation. So yeah, maybe we start with a few of those, and then if people have additional questions, feel free to write them in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask the question live. And yeah, we actually have I saw Kristen's here too, Kristen Marco, who was also on that galantamine study. So cool to see her there. So yeah, maybe Dash, I saw you had a couple questions in there. Maybe we start with one of yours. Probably easier if you just ask it live.
Oh yeah, so first question I had was what else do we know about phasic REM? Like, do our dreams look different in phasic REM, or are there any other studies about phasic REM? And like, we know if we could increase it, and could increasing it also increase lucid dreaming? So kind of just like anything you might, I don't know, have to say about phasic REM.
Yeah. So one of the things we know, so there's two substates of REM sleep. There's the phasic REM and tonic REM. And the phasic REM on a sleep hypnogram is mostly demarcated just by the presence of eye movements. But it depends a little bit on the research team and the criteria they're using. Some people use myoclonic twitching also in terms of seeing any kind of muscular twitching, which happens in REM sleep fairly frequently. Sometimes it's the combination of those two. But one of the things that's really been established is that the arousal threshold is higher in phasic REM. And so, in other words, it's easier to wake someone up from tonic REM. And you do see brain signatures of processing environmental input higher during the tonic REM segments. So it's a little unfortunate, actually, from one perspective, because if you hope to be able to, which, there has been exciting work on this recently in terms of communicating in real time with people, but it would be even easier to do that if that data was the other way around. But it just unfortunately turns out that it's more difficult to do that in phasic REM, or at least that's what that data might suggest. Of course, lucid dreaming could change the equation there in important ways in terms of your ability to allocate attention and things like that, or other physiological changes which we don't understand yet. But just in terms of the phasic tonic REM, that's one of the big ones, is the environmental processing. Overall, it's just a less activated state as well. I mean, that's typically what these different measures converge on. But it does tend to increase throughout the night, which also goes with the fact that lucid dreams tend to be more frequent in later REM cycles. And so that's another source of evidence as well that there is a connection between phasic activation and lucidity. So that's a few things, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
Well, I was wondering if, do we know if the content in phasic REM is different? With the content of those dreams?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar off the top of my head about, systematic cognitive differences between dreams across the two states. I don't know if anyone else knows here on the call.
I thought there were some studies that if you woke people up after eye movements, it was more likely for there to be like an action in a dream or something, I think, but it's not, I don't think it's that clear cut.
Yeah, there's nothing that I would feel confident saying this is really established difference in cognition between the two. But that's a great point. I mean, it's it could, and it could be there and I'm just not aware of it, but that's something that's worth investigating if not.
Yeah, and then the last part of that question was also do we know if we can increase phasic REM, and would that increase lucid dreams? Does anybody know about that?
Oh, you mean actually experimentally, doing
yeah,
that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of what, well, Kristen is here, but I think that is kind of what she was saying with Stephen in the Galantamine study, that it might increase phasic REM. And I was wondering if I hope I'm not quoting that wrong, but I was also wondering if there are other ways to do it.
Yeah, that's plausible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is plausible. Unfortunately, in that study, we didn't have sleep physiology. So we actually don't know, we aren't able to look at the effect of galantamine on phasic versus tonic REM in that particular data set. But I think that's a great future direction, is doing a study with sleep physiology. And actually, I think that galantamine is also the way to do the study, which I think many of us really want to see, which is the group level fMRI study. It's the way to do that. You have people, you're running the scanner at $500 an hour. You need to get people lucid. It's at least an interesting approach to doing it. And I think not only would it help people become lucid, we would also at the same time be able to learn about the neuro changes associated with galantamine itself, which would be useful and interesting just in terms of learning more about how it works. So yeah.
I
wonder if
know,
there's.
Oh, go ahead, Jay.
No, I just had a thought about adding, including people, if we have access to those who are the rare small sample of like natural, like sort of forced lucid dreamers, and to see if there's difference between their lucid dreams and ones kind of induced with galantamine or other techniques. But lots of stuff, studies to be done.
Yeah, and actually in the 2018 paper on galantamine, we did do some comparisons of lucid dreams under the placebo dose versus lucid dreams under the half and full doses of galantamine. So you can check that paper. We do some cognitive phenomenological analysis of differences there.
Very cool.
Yep.
It looks like Pedro's got a question about, and I'll go back to some of the earlier questions after this, but this might be kind of more in line with what we were just talking about with narcoleptics having a higher frequency of lucid dreaming. Pedro, do you want to add more kind of color commentary to your question, or should I just read it from the chat? I'll just read it from the chat. Yep. Yeah, so has there been any research in regards to the sleeping brain of narcoleptic patients versus lucid and non-lucid dreamers?
Yeah, and so I don't know a whole lot about this, and this is something I kind of didn't go into as well, just for lack of time. And also just taking a step back, I want to say there's a lot of things that I left out of my presentation too, so it wasn't totally comprehensive, and I was also highlighting some things that I've been most involved with. Hopefully I did communicate kind of at least my take on, some general trends in the literature. But the Daudet paper I mentioned, which found that decreased delta activity, was actually done on narcoleptic participants. And so incidentally, it's really interesting that people with narcolepsy tend to have a higher incidence of lucid dreams. And that also makes them great participants, a great participant pool to draw from. And a lot of the work from those groups in France and other places in Europe, Arnauf, and working with narcoleptics to do their lucid dreaming studies. So it's really cool. It's a way they can contribute, make a contribution to science. So we know that they do have a higher incidence of lucid dreams. The reasons for that are still being investigated. One of them is that they typically get very short latency REM onset. So if you have narcolepsy, you can go straight from wake into a REM sleep period very quickly, and that is favorable to lucid dreaming. There's likely other mechanisms as well. I don't think we have the full picture on that. But narcoleptics do tend to suffer sometimes from nightmares, and there's some preliminary data suggesting that training in lucid dreaming can be useful for that as well, but lots more work to be done. I think it's super preliminary, so.
Yeah, I see Lori Poliski has a question about group level fMRI studies and replication of the VOS study. Lori, do you want to ask the question, or should I just read it off the chat? All right, I'll just, oh, there she is. Hey. Oh, you're on mute. I'll unmute you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I have a lot of food in my mouth. Hi, everyone.
That's how
Thanks,
it works.
Brian. Wasn't planning to come on. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, gotcha.
My question, I have like the lamer questions. I feel like they're like more just science, like logistical questions. But this desired group level fMRI study would be incredible, but know how insanely expensive that is. And I'm just kind of curious who you think would fund that and like what justifications would be needed for that to happen. First question.
Yeah. Do I want to give this away before I apply for it? Yeah, well, I will. I think NSF would fund it. Yeah. I think that's one possible place to go. Also, well, I mean, if you took a clinical angle on it, you know, using lucid dreaming for nightmare prevention with idiopathic nightmares or PTSD or something like that, you might get interest from NIH. I think it's more of a stretch, but it's possible. Or private donors, you know, if anyone out there is watching and they want to contribute to lucid dreaming research, this would majorly move the field forward in terms of our understanding of the neurobiology of lucid dreaming. So I think there's potential there as well, because I really do see this as one of the things we want to understand in terms of making lucid dreaming accessible for humanity. And if we have a clear picture of what that looks like in terms of localized brain activations and also understanding the mechanisms of galantamine, that would be a huge step forward. So, so those are, you know, a few possibilities. There could be others as well. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on this, but I'm also all ears on this if anyone has any ideas.
Yeah, maybe I'll interject with a quick related question. And I see somebody raised their hand too. But as far as like biggest kind of barriers or, you know, kind of things holding back research within lucid dreaming, do we think it's funding? Is it something else, or is it a combination of things? Like, what do you think is holding back, you know, that kind of research?
Well, that particular study, it's funding, I think, is the bottleneck. No question, because there are people out there who would be able to do the research. They're trained to do the study. We have the personnel, but we don't have the funding for that one. For other studies, you know, it'd be great to get more people involved in the field. There are a few in the U.S. There's only a couple laboratories really that are doing research on this topic at the moment, and so yeah, more. So you know, that's not a wonderful place for a field of science to be in. You want many labs working on things. If you look at other kind of more mainstream topics like working memory or cognitive control or any of these other topics within cognitive neuroscience, you have, you know, dozens of labs working on these. And so imagine in a future in which we had, you know, dozens of labs working on lucid dreams. And I'm cutting out here a little bit, but I think just in quick summary, I think there are both funding and personnel bottlenecks.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, yeah, Lori, if you want to ask the second part of your question, I see Dave Bitzwatz raised his or her hands, but then raised it. So feel free to re-raise it if you want to pop back in. But yeah, Lori, feel free to hit up the second part of your question.
Sure. Well, yeah, commentary, just a response to that, like hot take, I think, on the NSF, like that would be, I'm excited for that. I would say also, just to add to like how this community is building and what the possibilities could be, we today just published an 150-person fMRI study that was almost half or 75% crowdfunded. And I could see with the avid Reddit community and this community and multiple online dream fanatics that could be a possibility here. Okay, second part of my question was just kind of about the reasoning behind replicating or investigating Voss's methods, like, and why that was chosen as instead of like other research questions. In a way, it seems a bit insular to like the neuroscience community and like the research community, but I'm just kind of curious why that was chosen.
Yeah, well, it's actually, in my view, it's really pervaded the public's imagination on lucid dreaming too. So if you go to, you know, I'm a bit biased because I have lucid dreaming on my brain all the time, and so I'm definitely looking for lucid dreaming in magazines. But I feel like I've seen lucid dreaming equals frontal 40 hertz activity in at least like 10 different magazines at the checkout stand at the grocery store. And so it has been the most widely popularized effect, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own, that people think that that is the neural signature of lucid dreaming. And then when you dovetail that with this whole idea that lucid dreaming is some kind of hybrid state as well, that other piece I think is also important to discuss and potentially correct, in my view. So it's also critical because of the conversation we had, for example, in this group last week. That study was built upon, in a way, in a future article in which they claim to be able to induce lucid dreams with 40 hertz current in the front of the brain. And there's a widespread perception that that actually works to induce lucid dreams. And, you know, as you may know, there are people who have built devices at home that are shocking themselves, and they're trying to induce lucid dreams using that technique. And if it turns out that that finding itself isn't what it was purported to be in the first place, it's really critical to correct that. But that study was addressed towards that. It was also addressed towards saying, look, we've got these 4 different studies all saying something different. It'd be helpful if we can take one off the table, and at the same time, our exploratory analysis allowed us to confirm the Daudet finding. So we have at least 2 studies now which are consistent with one another in terms of that reduction of slow frequency power. Again, I want to emphasize that difference in slow frequency power is something that's seen when you contrast the entire REM baseline to the lucid segment. So you can chop out segments of the REM baseline that wouldn't show any difference with the lucid segment in terms of slow frequency power. But if you look at the entire thing compared to the lucid segment, you get that reduction. So it's not a specific signature of lucidity. It's something that over the whole REM cycle tends to be slightly higher in lucidity. And then also the connection with the increased REM density. So it's a really important finding. I mean, I think that's the positive thing. It allows us to understand and combine results again, because we replicate the original finding of the increase in eye movement density. And that way explains this 40 hertz effect. So I see us as kind of trying to cross things out, put things together, try to make sense of what we've got there. And I think we have moved it forward a little bit. You know, it's even these results, you know, you may do another study and turns out you see something different. So this is just adding one more study to the bag. I'd like to see lots of replications. Hopefully we'll, over a series of studies, march our way towards a better understanding of what's going on. That's the general overall goal of that.
Thank you.
Nice. And I know, yeah, I think Ellison, you asked the initial question of the night. I don't know if we actually got to it or not yet. So I want to circle back on that related to fMRI. Did you want
that's totally fine. It was kind of I was just trying to figure out sort of like if there was the change in the sort of blood flow based on, you know, what types of lucid dreams people are having. But I know that it was kind of binary. Yes, there's a lucid dream. No, there's a lucid dream. And if that sort of like duration in a lucid dream or sort of like the higher levels of awareness within the space affected any of that stuff. And I know that wasn't measured, but I'd be really curious to understand that kind of thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the dream report for that record. It wasn't published, surprisingly, with the original paper. However, there's a major caveat to that finding also, which I didn't note, which I probably should have in the presentation, but the participant in the lucid dream during the fMRI case study was involved in a task. So they were clenching their left fist 10 times, then their right fist 10 times. And they subtracted out the left and right fist clenching, so you don't see motor activation. But during the whole time, they're doing this cognitive task, if you like. So they are having to maintain this attentional cognitive set of doing a task, which you might argue that's one of the things that you kind of get back when you become lucid. However, I think it's critical in thinking about what we want to do for a group level fMRI study that we also want a so-called no task segment where people aren't doing an explicit task like that, so that we can also contrast that segment of the record versus the baseline dreaming segment. And that will also be an important thing to understand in terms of clarifying which, if any, of those activations may be due to the task as opposed to lucidity per se.
Nice. And I see Bill Meyer has his hand raised, so I'll call on him so I'm not calling people out unexpectedly. Fire away, Bill.
Okay, great presentation, Ben, by the way. Very interesting. I have a kind of I have a question relating to phasic versus tonic REM. So when somebody goes, becomes lucid, does the percentage of time spent in phasic increase relative to the time in tonic? Because people are kind of switching back and forth through a REM period. So has that been looked at?
We've looked at it with our data, in this newer analysis that I presented, and we do see that there's increased phasic activity, which you might predict because of the higher eye movement density. But it depends on how the eye movements are structured. So I didn't show you enough really to be able to that you'd know that, because potentially all those eye movements could have been crunched together, and then there were long periods of time, even the lucid segment, where there's no eye movements. But that isn't really the case. That does happen. There's not always eye movements in the lucid segment, but overall there is much more eye movement activity ongoing. And so if you demarcate the records as phasic or tonic, we find that there is a higher percentage of phasic. This is in this one data set. So from these 14 records, we do see that, but I don't know that that's explicitly been looked at in other studies. If anyone else knows of one, feel free to chime in. But you would predict that any study seeing increased eye movement density on average, which would show that increased phasic activation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
And then both Sharon and Valerie were interested in like any connection between being left-handed and frequency of lucid dreaming. Not sure if that's been looked at before, if you know anything about that. A couple people were curious on that one.
I don't know. Anyone else knows anything, feel free to jump in. I'm not sure about that one.
Yeah, maybe something for future exploration.
I bet it's been looked at. There's that great resource book, Conscious Mind, Sleep, Brain, which summarizes a lot of the work that was done during those early days of work. And there's so much information in there. They looked at all kinds of personality variables and things like that. And I'm sure you'll find a study in there which looked at handedness and lucidity frequency. But whether that result would hold up or not is anyone's guess. Yeah, I'm sure it's been looked at, but I don't know what the data say.
Yeah, and I'm reading another one in the chat from A Biswas, and feel free people to raise your hand if you want to ask a question live too. This one's about maybe it falls in that category of has this research been done? So maybe it's not the best one to do next, but it's about are people in lucid dreams somewhat more suggestible? And he's asking fMRI correlation could be useful there. Maybe that's something that Karen and her group with interactive dreaming could eventually look at somehow, with two-way communication.
More suggestible? Can you clarify at all?
Yeah, A Biswas, if you're able to clarify, feel free to unmute yourself and clarify. But I was pretty much just reading verbatim.
Oh, hypnosis? Could you hypnotize someone in a lucid dream, in other words? I don't think anyone's done that study. Karen, have you guys done that?
No, I'll add it to the list.
Yeah. Put that at the top of the list. Yeah.
Probably be a few ethical implications with that one too. All right, looks like Link Daniel has raised his hand. Feel free to ask a question, Link.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, first of all, Ryan, thanks for bringing everyone together. It's awesome to see more people in the group. Benjamin, great presentation. I like that you brought a lot of data to the table, so that was good. Yeah, so my question is around I understand the importance of REM, and we talked last time a month ago about what are the cues or how can we trigger lucidity? But I think sometimes I'm wondering, as a kid, when I didn't know it was called lucid dreaming, I would just like, you know, in the morning, kind of like semi wake up and then fall back to sleep. And then I think so like that's like how I sort of like had more REM sleep. Like, you know, and when you have like the Oura Ring, for example, or like the Apple Watch, it shows you when you wake up as a percentage, what is your REM state? Like how much time have you spent in REM state? Like just like intuitively, like what do you think sort of increases, or how can we increase, you know, REM sleep as a percentage to like, you know, compared to like light sleep or deep sleep? And then as a caveat to that, because I've talked to a lot of people who then tell me, yeah, I know about lucid dreaming, but like, you know, I do it while I nap. And I think while you nap, there's no REM, I think, right? So, so then like, it seems also possible without REM. Yeah, but my question is mainly about like, you know, how can you increase REM as a percentage, I guess. Just how people who want to sleep well, you know, they're like, how can I spend more time in deep sleep? So like, how can I spend more time in REM? And feel free to also answer like, you know, from a scientific perspective, like what you think is like, yeah, contributing to that.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. Yeah. So first of all, I mean, me personally, I wouldn't want to start mucking around with my sleep cycles too much where I was just getting like lots of REM sleep over the night. Not that that's what you're suggesting, but some people may go that direction, and I would immediately say, hold on, you know, not sure that's a good idea, because slow wave sleep is so critical. But one of the things we definitely can do is sleep in longer. And, you know, as a kid, you were probably doing that just by default. I know I was. And, you know, it seemed like you can sleep in till noon and, you know, just kind of wake up, fall back asleep, keep sleeping. As the night goes on, you get longer REM cycles, and the time between them tends to decrease. So the best way to get really great REM sleep episodes is to sleep in. You can do things, and some things we know from the scientific literature. If you suppress REM sleep in the beginning of the night through substances, for example, you can get something called a REM rebound, in which you get crazy amounts of REM later in the night. And that can also induce lucid dreams, somewhat counterintuitively, because the substances that people take, sometimes psychoactive substances, you know, they inhibit REM sleep. So you think, well, how is that increasing lucid dreaming? Well, it's leading to REM rebound later in the night. And the nap phenomenon, it is true that naps at some times of the day tended to not have lucid dreams. And if you show up at the sleep clinic and have a nap and you have REM sleep at a certain time of day, they immediately will classify you as having a sleep disorder. But at other times of the day, it's normal to have REM sleep. So it depends on the different rhythms that you have and the time of day in which you're taking the nap. Incidentally, I've been learning that it's possible to do all of the lucid dreaming research studies that I did before by staying awake the entire night in the morning. So you can have people wake up at 7:00 a.m., come to the sleep lab. You know, if you're working with a population of undergraduates that can still sleep till noon, you can do recordings for 4 or 5 hours there in the morning, and that's prime time for REM. You're getting the longest, you know, REM periods right then. So in terms of the experimental side too, that's a great time. Yeah, so those are a few thoughts. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
All right, maybe I'll slip a question. And I see Joe Owens, you dropped a couple questions in, so maybe we'll hit you up next. But yeah, like let's envision a future where, you know, we have some techniques or technologies where, you know, all of a sudden lucid dreaming is, you know, somewhat on demand. We're able to like with that pretty high probability induce a lucid dream at any particular night. Like with this greater accessibility of the lucid dreaming state, like what kind of research studies would you be most excited to run, like in that future world where it's a lot easier to induce that state? Like, is there anything towards the top of your list, whether it be consciousness studies or elsewhere? Yeah,
that's a great one. I'm not sure I can reveal all of that. That's my next grant, sure. You know.
That's all good too.
But also, I mean, it's something that I'm really interested in brainstorming, because I think it'd be great to talk about in this group. If anyone has any thoughts on studies that they think would be interesting to run. I would love to hear people's thoughts on that, because I have a few ideas, but
I have a lot of ideas, but I just talked previously. So if other people have other ideas, I can talk afterwards.
Sounds good. Anybody have any? I see Jay's unmuted. Maybe you can go next.
Yeah, no, I was just, I mean, I definitely also have ideas for studies, as you know, but I was thinking back on the acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and like galantamine's effect on lucid dreaming. I know Kristen said it intensifies REM. It suddenly made me wonder about dream journaling, right? And I wonder if just because dream journal, like increasing dream recall by doing a dream journal seems to, in many cases, get people to spontaneously actually have lucid dreams without additional techniques. So now I'm curious if we know anything about just writing a dream journal. Does that affect REM itself? Does that changes the attributes of REM, or it makes it, you know, gives you more phasic REM or a deeper REM or more dense REM that such that it causes, or is that a different mechanism, you think?
My first take on that is that I think a large part of that effect is driven by becoming familiar of what your dreams are like. And that allows more of an interface between the waking you and your knowledge and memories and the dreaming you and your knowledge and memories. And just knowing what your dreams are like, knowing, you know, the common things that tend to happen in your dreams, that can be one method that many people find effective. Is once you know what those things are, that's one of the techniques behind MILD, right? Is you kind of start to catalog the common themes of your dreams, and then it kind of becomes like, oh yeah, of course, you know, once you've reflected on that so much during wake, it's like just almost automatic, like, oh, there's that crazy thing I tend to dream about again. And so I think a large part of the effect is probably something like that, as opposed to something physiological, changing REM sleep. But
that makes sense.
Yeah, that's more of intuition than you know, actually data driven in terms of answer there.
It's a good hypothesis. I like
so Ben, are you saying that if you're journaling, your hypothesis is that you're building a neural path or a habit, basically, of alerting yourself? You know, I'm using the alerting language for lucid dreaming, but those elements of the dream would be you're building a habit that then carries over into the dream and triggering lucidity out of that.
Yeah, that's one way it can happen, for sure. Yeah. It can also be, and I think you could separate those out. I mean, one way is just simply setting up the mental association where it happens automatically or spontaneously. Of course, people also do use that to train. So you know, if you have something to aim for in your episodic memory, when you're setting your prospective intention to recognize that you're dreaming, if you have a specific thing to aim for, then that can be very helpful. And so once you've learned the things that happen frequently in your dreams, that can be a very useful cue that you can train with while awake, and you can practice, you know, seeing that thing or that theme or whatever it is, and then recognizing that you're dreaming. And so it can be a way of training to have lucid dreams. It can also just be the simple mental association too. But yeah, I think that whole area is rich and not totally understood either, how that's exactly working. It's really, there's definitely something to that when you're journaling, when you're starting to reflect on your dreams from the waking state, you're establishing something of a continuity, more of a continuity between the dream world and the waking world. And just having your waking self reflecting on your dreams for whatever reason really does seem to be a powerful method for increasing the frequency of lucid dreams. And I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of exactly why that is, but those are a few of the ways it happens. There's likely others as well, I think, too, in other words.
Yeah. definitely could be a subject of a future research study, especially with like super frequent dream journalers. Are there actually differences in their brain, or like maybe they're making different types of connections? And yeah, who knows, another place to explore. And I know, Joe, you asked a question in the chat too. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was curious about, I think I'm actually more curious about psychological traits, if they've been just cataloged during the studies of lucid dreamers, and even anecdotally, if it's built up, if you're taking some sort of demographics, or just as you're, I know that the data is somewhat sparse, but I you know, if you have hypotheses from, you know, just all of the, you know, I know a lot of sleep researchers, and they'd just be like, oh, this is the guys that show up or whatever. And then after a while, they're like, huh, those guys are all depressed. Let's look at depression and sleep. You know, like those are the ones who are answering our ad to come into our lab. And then, you know, that kind of happens, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that there's likely many slices to the pie. So I think that there are probably some people that have lucid dreams spontaneously, frequently, for something that's more purely physiological. Like, for example, those differences in connectivity that we see. People may have some intrinsic differences in their brain architecture or connectivity, which give them a proclivity to have lucid dreams. Other people, it could be more of a personality. Of course, you know, there's many, it's overlapping, so they don't necessarily exclude each other. And it's plausible that there are some personality differences. You know, there are these two groups too. I think we can think of them as, you know, different groups. One group are people who are interested in lucid dreaming and they're training to have lucid dreams. The other group is this spontaneous, sometimes they're called natural lucid dreamers, people that for whatever reason, typically going back, you know, to as far as they can remember, they just, you know, have lucid dreams very frequently. And they are two, I think they're, you know, pretty substantially distinct groups there. So we can ask questions about personality with either one of those. In our studies of the natural or spontaneous lucid dreamers, we haven't seen robust differences in any of the personality questionnaires we've given out. Some of the earlier research, I know a number of studies found differences in the trait openness. So the Big Five, which is one of the most widely used questionnaires in psychology, one of the traits is openness to experience, and a number of studies found that lucid dreamers were higher on the trait openness. That was what I took away to be the most replicated personality trait. But again, would I bet money on that? Probably not. I'd like to see it replicated again. But of course, you know, with the training group, there's likely a certain, there probably are characteristics of people that are attracted to try to have lucid dreams, to try to train to learn to have them. I don't on the top of my head know exactly what they all are, but I think it's highly plausible that you would find some pretty robust differences just in that.
Has anyone looked at genetics?
In the scientific literature, not that I know of, but I've been intrigued by this for a long time. I've been interested in this, you know, for 20 years. And I remember a woman that I went to high school with, and she reported that she had lucid dreams all the time. She was blonde, and she reported that only the blonde people in her family but all the blonde people in her family had highly frequent lucid dreams. The brunette people didn't have lucid dreams with high frequency. And, you know, it's purely anecdotal. This is what she told me, but I have no reason to think that she was making this up. And so if that's true, it does potentially point to a genetic difference. So that's just one family. I haven't heard of similar stories from other people, but you know, it's definitely a line of research worth pursuing, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I see Dash has her hand raised. Maybe I'll hit her up with a question first. Do blondes have more fun in dreams? Is that true or false from your perspective?
Wait, I'm not. Am I considered blonde? Is that?
No, I'm saying like you can give the counter argument.
Oh, because I'm not blonde. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I was
That's
just
not to
thinking,
say
I'm
that
like,
only blonde people have lucid dreams, of course, but in her
yeah.
family, yeah.
I'm
Right,
like, I'm going through, we have Allison, we have Karen. I'm like thinking, who are the blondes? Anyways, yeah, so I had a related question. You said that you guys did a study with frequent lucid dreamers where they had like more connection between two parts of the brain, but like, was that in the slide? It said frequent lucid dreamers. It didn't specify if they were naturally frequent or trained. Were they?
Yeah, these were naturals.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, spontaneous. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But of course, you know, one of the things we really want to do is with any kind of cross-sectional study like that, where you have one group and another group, there's always the possibility that there's some other difference about this group. So a nitpicker can always say, well, you're not actually showing that difference is due to lucidity per se. What you really want to do actually is a training study, which you take people who are interested in lucid dreaming but don't have lucid dreams hardly at all. You scan their brains and you get that, and then you train them to have lucid dreams a lot, and then you scan their brains again. And it would be amazing to do that study to see if we replicate this finding or not. If you found the same pattern, that would be very convincing at that point that that we're onto something here with this set of regions. So.
And could you talk a bit about like kind of your perspective on training for lucid dreams and how we might layer on these kind of supplements and devices on top of that like foundation of kind of mental techniques, or like kind of your thoughts on how those should play together? Like, should people start with the foundation of you know, dream journaling and techniques, or jump right to supplements? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, my general take is that all the supplements and the devices are going to be much more effective if you have the cognitive foundation. And so that stuff is free and easy. Well, it's not always easy, but it's at least free. And it's you know, it's low risk. You know, you're just remembering your dreams and journaling and things like this. You're not taking, you know, weird substances and things like this. So I think it makes sense to start there, and your mileage may vary. You actually may get pretty far with those techniques alone, depending on your interest and proclivities, level of commitment, and so forth. But I think it's something that's been overlooked. I sort of mentioned this very briefly in the presentation, but even some of the scientific reviews, I think, have kind of overlooked this point that just in terms of how the different induction methods are often thought about or categorized, having the right mental set is something that some of these other techniques are really predicated on. So a sleep mask that's giving you flashing lights, if you're not in the cognitive mental set of trying to recognize those lights as your mnemonic cue to become lucid, it's not going to be very effective. It might still work sometimes, or you might get so used to it over a long period of time that it can be effective without much training. But really, you have to be able, you know, getting the flashing lights into your dream is the first part of the problem. But you really have to be you have to be in the right cognitive mental set to effectively make use of those. The same is true, I think, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, though, with galantamine. You know, and I think it's going to be much, much more effective if you are training to have lucid dreams and you're using galantamine as a supplemental aid on top of it. That being said, I have heard numerous reports of people simply taking galantamine, not doing anything else, and they're having success with that. But so I think there's just a lot of individual differences in how different supplements or techniques, how well they work for one person versus another. Your mileage may vary, but overall, I think the most effective technique, you know, if you're asking, I want to have more lucid dreams, how can I do that? I would definitely advise, in general, starting off with the cognitive techniques and then building on that with Wake Back to Bed, or the induction masks or galantamine on top of that. Because I mean, our data definitely suggests that, you know, putting them together just ramps up how effective it is.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. The better together, and I think you know, part of the reason these cognitive techniques are difficult to build a habit around is you don't often get that reward. You know, like you do all this dream journaling and wake back to bed, but if you don't get that actual reward of a lucid dream, it's difficult to build that habit. And that's where I think like maybe it's good to get like try to mix in galantamine just to kind of jumpstart it, and then you can get a kind of a flavor for that lucid dream, and that can serve as motivation to go deeper into these cognitive techniques. But yeah, make it make sense, build the foundation, and kind of build up from there.
Yeah, I think it's an open question. We might get to a place in the future where we can flip the switch
totally
without doing it. I think that's open for debate and discussion, but we're nowhere near there right now. So
right, yeah, seems like the most reasonable near-term solution there until we have that future state. I see Brandon Zimmerman dropped in the chat about any kind of dietary and or supplement recommendations for remembering dreams or dream recall. Should people be eating cheese? Should they be taking vitamin B6 or galantamine, or like any thoughts around kind of dietary or supplemental things for dream recall?
I really don't know that literature super well. Does anyone else want to chime in on that?
There's some study on B6 by Denholm Aspie from Australia. There's some interesting data about and about even a technique of dream journaling that just uses minimal like bullet points to describe entire dreams, and you still are able to create better recollections and such. But B6 specifically and not B complex seems to work, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think,
for
these one-off studies, we got to like hopefully replicate, we'll get a better picture over time, but I'm not sure it's needed either. Just try journaling. It's
the one thing I would say cautionary is be careful how you mix all these supplements, because like sometimes they don't work too well together. For example, B6 and galantamine I don't think goes well together. So yeah. So beyond recommendations, always careful to understand. Like otherwise, you take so many things, and like there may actually be some harmful like side effects. Like there's actually this book.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a good.
The Neuroscience book on lucid dreaming supplements.
Oh, I think. Sorry, I was a little choppy there for a second, so it may have come in and out. But one interesting approach there is if we can have sleep tech that will wake people up at the end of a REM cycle, that would be helpful, because one of the things that we see all the time in the sleep laboratory is people come in and they say, I don't dream. I don't have dreams. And we wake them up out of REM sleep throughout the night and they're dreaming constantly. And they're like, wow, I can't believe all the dreams I'm having. And so with sleep tech, this is one of the things that we could do. You can program it to wake you up right at the opportune moment at the end of the sleep cycle. That would allow you to remember your dreams much more effectively. So I think that's an interesting approach as well. And a baby could maybe do that also if you don't have a sleep mask.
Yeah, my son Connor wanted to make a cameo appearance. He helps with my wake back to bed technique when he wakes up in the middle of the night.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's a good segue to C. Webb's question about physiological or other perspectives, like why does wake back to bed seem to increase lucid dreaming likelihood?
Yeah. My view, we don't know the answer to that question right now. Anyone else can feel free to jump in here, but it's something that was kind of discovered. There was people reported waking up in the middle of the night and doing all kinds of different activities, like meditating, having sex, reading. People reporting all these things led to increased lucidity. And so it kind of emerged from that. LaBerge and other people pointed out, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's just waking up and going back to sleep. And that seems to be the case. But there are probably activities that on top of that make it even more effective. And so I'd like to see more research on that too, comparing different types of activities during the waking segment against each other to see what may be more effective. One way that it could be working is just simply increasing activation of certain brain areas that are more active during wake. When you go back to sleep, you're typically going back into a REM cycle fairly quickly. So it's something you're getting closer to, that kind of sleep on or that sleep onset REM period where you're very quickly going into a REM cycle and you're coming in with potentially greater activation in some areas. But we need to actually image that and look at it to find it.
I would actually love to look at changes to neurotransmitters. So I recently had to wake up at 2 a.m. to put a saliva in a tube to check my cortisol and melatonin levels, for sleep issues and other reasons. And I wonder if we'll wake up back to bed and see changes in, again, melatonin levels, cortisol, acetylcholine, or any of those. And I wonder if we'll find some correlation.
It'd be great.
One more kind of food for thought. Sometimes we're a CGM sensor that tracks glucose continuously. And that I've been noticing spikes around, not spikes, but gradual increases around like when I wake up during the middle of the night. So I think that's kind of related to cortisol, release too. You tend to release more glucose into your bloodstream at that point. So maybe it's a whole kind of a cascade of things that heightens your awareness. But yeah, another thing to put in the category of future research, which is kind of a theme here. A lot of kind of space uncharacterized, which maybe that's a good segue to one question I had. I know we're at the 8 p.m. Pacific time mark. So quick time check. Ben, are you able to stay a few minutes more?
Yeah, definitely. Okay,
cool. So I see more in the chat, more questions in the chat, but on the point of characterizing this, and like there's a lot of like degrees of freedom. Do you think it's is there anything in particular we think we need to clarify first? Is it like the stimulate? I'm thinking of like devices. Is it like certain, like having the precise location of a stimulation site? Is it like the right kind of modality of stimulation, whether it's like alternating current or direct current or like magnetic, or is it like the dosage of that? Or is it like doing it at the right time? Or is it really a combination of that? Or like, do we just really not know at this point?
Yeah, I think part of the equation there is getting a firm handle on what the precise brain areas are, getting just a very good understanding of what that is. If we knew definitively it's the anterior prefrontal cortex or the angular gyrus, for example, then we can build on that knowledge to try different methods of activating that brain area. That's one like fairly logical way to go about it. And I think we have a lot of different sources of preliminary evidence pointing to those regions, but we're still not there in terms of a very confident characterization of the localized brain activity changes. So I'd want to see that research first and then try to go more towards different methods for stimulating those regions. But that's the slow science way. And of course, you might get lucky and just figure out something that works. But often you're kind of shooting around in the dark, hoping that something's going to work. And so you might be able to go that way. But it's definitely trickier. But that's kind of in general how I think about that.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I see Aaron Chung has a question in the chat. It's getting a few plus ones. Do you want to ask the question, Aaron, or should I just read it? I can just read it. Yeah. So this is asking about, are there more specific details regarding the effect of sleeping conditions that they have in relation to more frequent lucid dreaming, factors such as sleep position, weighted or unweighted blankets, wearing a sleep mask, different breathing patterns for wake back to bed method? What were the conditions for the studies conducted, i.e. subjects allowed to sleep however they normally do, or were those factors controlled?
Yeah, so in our studies, we didn't control any of those factors. So that's just a lot of noise, really, you know. Yeah, I think this also goes in the pile of interesting things for future research. I don't think that we have a good handle on any of that. People have tried to look at like breathing laterality and things like that, but I think that the data is not particularly compelling in terms of a clear story at this point. But that was something that Lucidity Institute was looking at for a long time. LaBerge may disagree with me. I'm not sure, but my view is that we need more work on that before there's like a compelling story. But I think those are interesting questions. Sleeping position is interesting. There may be something to sleeping on one's back. I'm not sure. I can't sleep on my back personally. I'll lay awake the whole night. But I've heard that anecdotally from some people. Worth investigating.
Yeah, no, for sure. I've definitely experienced that anecdotally, kind of more. Actually, that's when I get more of these wake-induced lucid dreams on my back and more sleep paralysis. I know. I see Ryan Hurd in the audience. I'm not meaning to call him out, but I know he's very into the like sleep paralysis domain, and you know how that can be a portal, into lucid dreaming if you can kind of jujitsu it in the right way, of like that being afraid of the sleep paralysis, but use it as into a portal, kind of to have a lucid dream. Yeah, so I've heard of that anecdotally, but yeah, seems like in the pile of future research, as you said. So yeah, let me backtrack into the chat here. Or yeah, Link, if you want to ask the question, go for it.
Yeah, just on the funding. So I mean, Benjamin, you mentioned this briefly before, right? About how important it is to have more funding to accelerate research. So what do you think needs to happen, practically speaking? Because if you look at for example, with CRISPR and Harvard University within neuroscience, there's not necessarily willingness now to be open source, and to share research. But I think apart from just getting donations, if you really want to accelerate this industry, you need to think more about how to create incentives and how to sort of do that. So I mean, I don't know what thoughts you have on this, but I think it seems to me that's one of the most important things you can do, because the technology at the moment is not good enough really to accelerate induction methods. We've been going on for decades now, and it seems to me we need better funding, which will then lead to technology will be accessible to then basically do more research, right, and create better methods to induce lucid dreams. So just I guess more conversation, but just your thoughts on how we can get there, what's necessary, because that's what I'm working actively on. So if you have any feedback or thoughts, yeah.
Well, this is a question I very much wanted to know the answer to myself. Something I'm, trying to piece together, and also interested in hearing, everyone's perspective on. But I think this is a great conversation to have going forward, because I think it is, if we can figure out more ways to garner funding, we really will be able to move the field forward in important ways that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. I mean, there are the traditional funders. I think it's worth pursuing those, because I think we're reaching a point where research on this topic is finally becoming more accepted in mainstream science. And so really a lot of the funding agencies haven't funded research on this ever. And therefore, in a weird way, they may actually be more open to it to some extent. So I think basic funding agencies like the NSF, for example, other agencies which fund basic science are worth at least going to explore that. And then someone else brought up earlier, maybe Jay, or someone else, the crowdsourcing ideas. But I think, to some extent it's a catch-22, as you're pointing out. But I think there's a huge interest in these topics amongst the amongst humanity. And so, I think it's worth exploring. I don't know, personally, I'm not super well versed in ways for going about getting that type of funding, but I definitely think it's worth exploring. And I think there's a huge demand for sleep tech, which would help people have lucid dreams. And so,
yeah, 8 Sleep is a good example. The mattress, you know, like, I mean, they're very successful. Or even Aura Ring, even a lot of these things, like.
Yeah, come on, the Aura Ring.
Right? Is Aura Ring better than Apple Watch? It gives you more accurate data?
It depends what you're measuring. I think for you know, things like heart rate and heart rate variability, measuring from the finger tends to be better than the wrist. But that's probably a separate conversation. But we feel pretty good about the sensing site on the finger. But yeah, to you know, Ben's point, I think like you know, if we can kind of crack the nut on more funding to enable this research to really just uncover, you know, like the unknowns. There's just like you know, seemingly like bottomless pit of things to explore, like degrees of freedom to explore here. And then hopefully we can get in this virtuous cycle with the actual people developing these technologies, you know, acting on these insights from the research and, you know, commercializing them into devices that actually work. I know that the field has kind of fallen short so far. It tends to be more marketing hype than, you know, effective devices to date. Not to say that won't be the case in the future. But, you know, really looking forward to that future where we can actually have this nice kind of two-way collaboration between researchers and people developing devices. People develop devices, they get validated by researchers. It seems like there wants to be this kind of virtuous cycle between researchers and people that develop these products. And I think I'm hopeful that this group can be a catalyst for that, to connect the dots between those two groups.
Yeah.
Any final questions or thoughts? I know, Jay, you just went off.
Well,
anything there?
What's encouraging is that there's a general increase in direct public funding of science. It's becoming more acceptable. There are more platforms to facilitate it. And then in addition to that, if you just look at the amount of money that went into a lot of these technological developments for dreaming and lucid dreaming, for sleep tech, that is a lot of money already. And that is just scratching the surface because we're just really getting started with this industry. And I think there is a way to align the incentives here where funding from like private industry can actually be purposefully calibrated to fund the science at the same time, and the science in the service of developing technology. And if you do that right, and there's conversations that are going on to try to do that, I absolutely think that we can like greatly accelerate funding of lucid dreaming science. That's the plan.
Yeah, I think I said it last time, where it feels like this pile of dry wood waiting to just get the right spark to catch fire. I feel like these crowdfunding campaigns are hundreds of thousands of dollars, so definitely a demand there, and I think eventually that will get delivered on. So I think we're done with questions, at least not seeing any more in the chat. So maybe we'll do kind of a, you know, if Ben, if you have any final thoughts, and maybe I could, you know, plug the final question here. If there's anything that you're just most excited about in the field of lucid dreaming research, if that's not tipping your hand too much on you know.
I think that Sheila also had a question earlier, right? Just wanted to make sure everyone. No.
Who had Dash had a question.
She seems to be, yeah. But her microphone.
Oh yeah, she's trying to get off mute. So yeah, Dash.
Sorry, no. There's something weird happened with my, like, the chat got really big and it was all okay. I don't have a question. I don't.
Okay.
Yeah, but Ben, any kind of final thoughts or anything you're kind of most excited about in this field, which I know is kind of a generic question, but feel free to take that any direction you want.
Yeah, well, I mean, I really agree with what you were both saying just now. I mean, I think there is an exciting potential for the synergy between the science and the device development, because you really need scientific studies to actually make devices that really work. And so community building, if we can have a group of interested people who wants to go in on version 1.0, then essentially what we're doing is science. You know, and it's a much more efficient way of doing the science too. If people can have devices that they're sleeping with in their natural home environments, as opposed to coming in the lab and having me stay awake the whole night watching them, it's better for everyone. So, and you can collect so much more data that way. So I think that's like really the future of of doing science on these topics is we have home devices, and that will help us learn what works and what doesn't work together, and just with huge amounts of data coming in, and then we can iterate, and 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, we get better and better and better. So I think it's got huge potential. It's just a matter of figuring out the nuts and bolts of how to do it exactly. But yeah, that's maybe what I'm most excited about, really, is just the future of that.
Nice. Yeah. +1 to all of that. And yeah, maybe that's a good place to end it for tonight. So I want to thank everybody, for joining and coming with good questions and ideas. And, thanks again, Benjamin, for joining and, walking through your presentation there and, being pretty generous with your time on Q&A. I think that was a great discussion. So thanks again for joining.
Oh yeah, I was super glad to be here. It was great. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to these future conversations too. So
yeah,
thank you for having me.
Getting started.
Thank you. That's fantastic, as usual.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.